I should have listened to the locals. I should have turned around the moment I saw those rusted chains on the iron gates, their metal links corroded by decades of Pennsylvania winters. But curiosity killed the cat, as they say, and I nearly became that cat. What happened at Millbrook State Hospital still haunts my dreams 3 years later, and I'm only telling this story now because I need someone else to know. Someone else to carry this burden. It was October 2019 when I first heard about Millbrook. I was researching abandoned buildings for my urban exploration photography blog when an elderly man at May's Diner in rural Clearfield County mentioned it. The whole place went quiet when he spoke the name, conversations dying mid-sentence like someone had sucked the air from the room. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and his weathered hands trembled so badly around his coffee cup that the liquid rippled. "Been closed since '78, he said, glancing nervously at the other patrons. "State shut it down real sudden like. But sometimes you can still see lights in the windows at night. Orange lights, like candles. Moving from room to room." The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, set down my plate with more force than necessary. "Don't go filling outsiders' heads with nonsense, Earl," she said, but her voice carried no real conviction. "That place is dangerous. Floors could give way, walls could collapse. That's all." But Earl wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his breath smelling of cigarettes and regret. "My nephew went there on a dare back in '95. Came back different. Wouldn't talk for 3 days, then started screaming about the basement. Had to send him to a facility downstate. Still there, far as I know." The official records were frustratingly sparse. Millbrook State Hospital had housed patients with severe mental illnesses from 1923 until its abrupt closure. Budget cuts and changing treatment philosophies, the bureaucratic reports claimed. Nothing about the 17 patients who died in the final year of operation. I had to dig through newspaper archives to find those obituaries. Nothing about why the entire staff abandoned their posts without giving notice, leaving behind personal belongings, half-eaten meals, and patient files scattered like autumn leaves. I spent 2 weeks researching, driven by an obsession I couldn't explain. The more I learned, the more questions arose. Former employees refused to speak on record. The county commissioner who signed the closure order died in a car accident just 6 months later. Patient families had filed lawsuits claiming negligence and cover-ups, but the cases were settled out of court with sealed records. The most disturbing discovery came from a 1979 Philadelphia Inquirer article buried deep in the archives. Mystery surrounds final days of Millbrook Hospital. It mentioned strange sounds heard by neighbors, reports of figures moving behind windows weeks after the closure, and a groundskeeper who claimed to see patients wandering the grounds at night. The article ended abruptly, as if the reporter had been forced to stop investigating. I found the asylum on a gray October afternoon when the clouds hung low like a burial shroud. 3 miles outside Millbrook Township, hidden behind a wall of dead oak trees that seemed to lean inward, forming a natural barrier against the outside world. The October sky was the color of old pewter, and a cold wind carried the smell of decay and something else, something that reminded me of the funeral home where I'd said goodbye to my grandmother years earlier. The building was massive, a Gothic revival monument to humanity's darkest impulses. 5 stories of red brick facades stretched before me, punctuated by arched windows that stared down like the hollow eye sockets of a skull. Paint peeled from the wooden trim like diseased skin, and ivy crawled up the walls with an aggressive hunger, as if the earth itself was trying to drag the structure into its embrace. Gargoyles perched on the corners of the roof, their stone faces worn smooth by decades of weather, but their expressions of anguish remained eternally frozen. The front gates were chained shut with a heavy padlock that looked newer than it should have, but the wrought iron fence was broken in several places where tree roots had pushed through the foundation. I squeezed through a gap near the eastern corner, my camera bag catching on rusted wire that seemed to grab at me like skeletal fingers. The moment I stepped onto the grounds, the silence hit me like a physical force. No birds, no insects, no distant traffic sounds. Just the whisper of wind through bare branches and the crunch of dead leaves beneath my feet. The main entrance was boarded up with sheets of plywood marked with warnings about trespassing and structural instability, but I'd done my homework. A side door near the service entrance hung ajar, its frame warped by years of neglect. The metal hinges screamed in protest as I pushed it open wider, the sound echoing through empty corridors like a cry for help. My first breath inside the building nearly made me vomit. The air was thick and stagnant, filled with the smell of mold, decay, and something else, Something sweet and cloying that coated the back of my throat and made my stomach turn. It was the smell of things that should have been buried long ago but refused to stay dead. The corridor stretched before me, lit only by the gray light filtering through grimy windows. Patient rooms lined both sides of the hallway, their doors standing open like gaping mouths frozen in eternal screams. Wheelchairs sat abandoned where they'd been left decades ago, some tipped over, others positioned as if their occupants had simply vanished mid-conversation. Rust stained the linoleum floors in patterns that looked disturbingly like dried blood, and sections of ceiling tiles had collapsed, creating treacherous piles of debris. In one room, a calendar still hung on the wall, forever frozen on November 1978. The paper was yellow and brittle, but the image was clear, a pastoral autumn scene with golden leaves and a red barn. Someone had circled November 15th in red ink, and beside it, in handwriting that slanted desperately across the page, were the words "They're coming for us tonight." I was documenting everything with my camera, the flash illuminating corners that hadn't seen light in decades, when I heard it, a sound like fingernails dragging across wood. Slow, deliberate scratches that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the building. I told myself it was just the old structure settling, pipes contracting, vermin in the walls. But the sound had a rhythm to it, a purposeful cadence that suggested intelligence behind the noise. The administrative wing was on the second floor, accessible by a marble staircase whose banister was carved with intricate scrollwork now choked with dust and cobwebs. Here, the destruction was more complete. Patient files were scattered across the floor like fallen snow, their contents spilled in a chaos of personal histories and medical observations. Water damage had made much of the writing illegible, but fragments remained. Patient exhibits extreme paranoia, unexplained marks on arms, claims to see deceased relatives. One file remained mostly intact, caught beneath an overturned desk. Patient 247, Sarah Chen, age 19. The photograph showed a young Asian woman with intelligent eyes that held too much fear for someone so young. Her admission date was October 1978, just weeks before the hospital's closure. The medical notes painted a picture of a college student who'd suffered a nervous breakdown after the death of her parents in a car accident. But it was the final entry that made my blood run cold: patient increasingly unresponsive to treatment. Moved to basement isolation for observation. November 15, 1978. Dr. Margaret Hensley. November 15. The same date circled on the calendar downstairs. There was a basement. Of course there was a basement. I found the stairs behind a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The wooden steps descended into absolute darkness, each board creaking ominously under my weight. My flashlight beam cut through the black like a knife, revealing stone walls that wept with moisture and something darker. The sweet smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming, mixed with the musty odor of earth and something that reminded me of meat left too long in a warm room. The basement corridor was different from the upper floors. While the patient areas above had been designed with at least a pretense of comfort, this place made no such concessions. It was a dungeon in all but name. Heavy steel doors lined both sides of the narrow hallway, each marked with a number and fitted with a small window at eye level. These weren't patient rooms, they were isolation cells, punishment chambers for those deemed too dangerous or too troublesome for the general population. Some doors stood open, revealing cramped spaces barely large enough for a cot and a bucket. Others remained locked, their windows black as midnight. I tried to peer through several, but the glass was too dirty, too streaked with substances I didn't want to identify. In cell number 7, I found scratch marks on the walls, deep gouges in the concrete that could only have been made by fingernails worn down to bloody stumps. The marks formed words, "Let me out," carved over and over in letters that grew smaller and more frantic as they climbed toward the ceiling. I was photographing the corridor when my flashlight died without warning. The darkness that enveloped me was absolute, deeper than any night I'd ever experienced. It pressed against me like a living thing, filling my lungs with each breath until I felt like I was drowning in black water. In that suffocating darkness, I heard it clearly, breathing that wasn't my own. Slow, labored breaths coming from somewhere ahead of me, echoing off the stone walls with a wet, rattling quality that spoke of damaged lungs and prolonged suffering. Then came the whispers, not words exactly, but sounds that carried the shape of human speech, like voices heard through thick glass or from the bottom of a deep well. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it twice before managing to activate the flashlight app. The LED illuminated the corridor in harsh, blue-white light that created deep shadows in every corner. At the end of the hallway, I saw an open cell that I hadn't noticed before, number 13, though I was certain it had been closed when I'd passed it moments earlier. The light revealed scratches in the concrete wall inside the cell, carved letters that spelled out two words in jagged, desperate script, "Help me." Below the plea, someone had been keeping track of days. Tally marks covered every inch of available wall space, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged in groups of 5 with the fifth mark slashed diagonally across the other 4. But these marks looked fresh, carved with something sharp enough to leave concrete dust on the floor below. That's when I saw her. A young woman sat in the corner of the cell, her knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around her shins in a gesture of infinite vulnerability. Her hair was long and black, hanging in lank strands that obscured most of her face. She wore a hospital gown that should have rotted away decades ago but looked as white and clean as the day it was issued. Her feet were bare, and I could see that her toenails were broken and bloody, as if she'd been trying to claw her way through stone. She looked up at me with eyes that I recognized from the photograph upstairs, Sarah Chen, patient 247, who should have been dead for over 40 years. But time seemed to have stopped for her in this place, preserving her in an eternal moment of anguish and desperation. "You can see me," she whispered, and her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing from the walls, the ceiling, the very air around me. "You're the first one in so long who can see me." I wanted to run, every instinct screaming at me to flee this place and never look back. But something in her voice, a note of such profound loneliness and hope, kept my feet planted on the cold stone floor. "What happened to you?" I managed to whisper back. Her laugh was like breaking glass, sharp and painful to hear. "They said I was getting better. Dr. Hensley said the treatments were working. But I could see things, hear things. The others who had died here, they were still here, still suffering. I tried to tell them, tried to make them understand." Behind her, in the deeper shadows of the cell, I began to see other shapes. Figures in hospital gowns, patients who had died in this place over the decades, their forms wavering like heat mirages but unmistakably present. Some bore the marks of lobotomies, others showed signs of the brutal treatments that had passed for medical care in the asylum's darkest years. "They brought me down here on the last night," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, more urgent. "November 15th. The night before they were supposed to close the hospital. Dr. Hensley said it was just temporary, just until the transfer could be arranged. But there was no transfer. They left us here, locked us in these cells, and walked away." The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the walls. The other figures grew clearer, more solid, their faces turning toward me with expressions of hunger and desperate need. "We've been waiting," Sarah said, standing now, moving toward the open cell door with movements that didn't quite sync with the sound her feet should have made on stone. "Waiting for someone who could see us, who could tell our story. Who could set us free." That's when I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran like I've never run before, my phone's light bouncing wildly as I stumbled through the darkness. Behind me, I could hear other voices joining Sarah's, patients calling out, pleading, some laughing with a sound like breaking glass mixed with grinding metal. The basement corridor seemed to stretch impossibly long, and the darkness felt alive, reaching for me with cold tendrils that brushed against my neck and whispered promises of eternal companionship. I burst through the side door into the dying daylight, gasping for air that didn't taste of decay and desperation, my lungs burning as if I'd been running for miles. Only when I reached my car did I realize I'd left my camera behind in that hellish place, along with something else, a piece of my sanity that I knew I'd never get back. I drove straight to the Millbrook Township Police Station, my hands still shaking as I recounted my experience to the officer on duty. Sergeant Walsh listened patiently to my story, occasionally jotting notes in a thick folder that I noticed was already bulging with similar reports. "You're the 14th person to report strange things at Millbrook this year," he said when I finished. "We've searched that building top to bottom more times than I can count. It's empty. Always has been since the closure. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. And more importantly, I knew that something was still trapped in that place, something that had been abandoned by the world and forgotten by time." 3 months later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was my camera, exactly as I'd left it in that basement corridor. Every photo I'd taken was there, each image perfectly preserved on the memory card. Except for one. The last image wasn't one I remembered taking. It showed the isolation cell from a different angle, as if the camera had been moved after I'd fled. The tally marks were there, clear and sharp in the flash's illumination. The scratched plea for help stood out like an accusation against the concrete wall. But in the corner where I'd seen Sarah Chen, there was nothing but shadow and empty space. Except, if you looked closely, really closely, you could make out shapes in the darkness. Figures hunched against the walls, their faces turned toward the camera with expressions of infinite sadness and desperate hope. And in the very center of the frame, so faint it might have been a trick of light and shadow, were two words scratched into the air itself: "Help US." I haven't been back to Millbrook, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still and the world feels thin, I dream of that basement corridor. In my dreams, I can hear them calling, all of them, the patients who never left, who are still waiting in their isolation cells for someone to acknowledge their existence, to bear witness to their suffering. Still waiting for someone who won't run away. The locals were right about one thing: sometimes you can see lights in the windows at night. But they're not electric lights, and they're not candles. There's something else entirely, something that suggests the asylum's doors closed in 1978, but its business, its terrible, unfinished business, continues in the darkness between worlds. I still have the camera. I still have that final photograph, though I've stopped looking at it after I noticed that the figures in the shadows seem to move slightly each time I view the image. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my darkroom developing film, I swear I can hear that voice again, young, desperate, echoing from somewhere beyond the walls of the world I thought I knew. You can see me. You can help us. I never should have looked back. But I did, and now I can never forget what I saw in the basement of Millbrook State Hospital. They're still there, still waiting, still hoping that someone will return to finish what I started. Someone braver than I was. Someone who won't abandon them to the darkness.